Hello, my name is Dalton Honeycutt. Today I'm going to be talking about psychological safety in high-performance organizations. I've conducted a literature review that has synthesized a lot of research regarding this topic in order to demonstrate how psychological safety affects organizations and how it brings about high performance. So we know that psychological safety is necessary because it brings about innovation. Now, organizations are increasingly relying on innovation in order to maintain their competitive advantage. Without innovation, you are not able to maintain that competitive advantage within the marketplace. Psychological safety is defined as this: employees have to be able to feel safe to take risk and provide feedback to their supervisors. Now, this review is going to synthesize a lot of data from various different sectors. This will include steel mills, K through 12 education, and even healthcare providers. This is just to see how safety operates within different industries and how it brings about high performance. Now, you may be wondering what the point of this review is, because after all, it kind of makes sense that a workplace must have safety. However, the main point of this review is to synthesize research to demonstrate that psychological safety is not just an option or a nice-to-have feature, it's the primary driver of performance within organizations. And so this review is going to illustrate how organizations can foster that psychological safety and offer strategies so that way leaders can start to implement it within their organizations rather than just expecting it to naturally occur. Three key themes emerged from this literature review, and the first one is mediating behaviors and relationships. Now, innovation doesn't just come directly from psychological safety. Rather, psychological safety offers a mediating behavior in order to bring about innovation. One example shows that from a study that was done in South Korea of over 500 personnel, that by having psychological safety in the workplace, people were more willing to share their opinions and feedback. This was also done in high-tech companies, which actually showed that the quality of information increased the more psychologically safe employees felt. This shows that psychological safety offers a mediating behavior that brings about innovation. It's not psychological safety itself that is the driver of innovation, but the behaviors that come about because of psychological safety. The quality of relationships also affects innovation. So whenever you have high psychological safety within an organization, you're able to build higher quality relationships. A study was done over a couple of different organizations and projects, including Google's Project Aristotle and Netflix's Corporate Culture. This study found that when there was higher quality relationships within the workplace, employees were more willing to share their ideas and challenge each other. However, when this wasn't the case, it found that employees were more defensive and weren't willing to share these ideas. Because the ideas were never challenged, it led to less innovation and less risk-taking. Therefore, psychological safety brings about mediating behaviors and relationships that bring about innovation within the organizational workplace. The second theme is determinative factors. There's different determinative factors of psychological safety, and there's two different contrasting views, which we can actually synthesize into one. So the first view is the leadership perspective. This view says that if there is an ethical leader, there's going to be more psychological safety. A study done over different finance teams and another study done over different construction teams actually found that ethical leaders bring about more workplace safety, which then brought about more innovation. And this is because ethical leaders lead by example and demonstrate qualities that bring about workplace safety. Now, the other view is organizational culture. This view states that safety within the workplace doesn't just come from one or two leaders, rather it comes from instilling a broader organizational culture that instills workplace and organizational safety. Ultimately, both of these views can actually be synthesized into one particular view, which is that it requires both. It requires both leadership and organizational culture in order to bring about psychological safety. A study done in London over different healthcare providers actually found this, because even when there was good leadership, psychological safety wasn't able to come about unless different structural barriers within the organization were taken down. In order to have psychological safety, there has to be good leadership and a strong organizational culture that points people towards being able to provide feedback and to take risk. The third theme is social culture and context. So social culture refers to the social dynamics within the workplace. In order to be able to have high levels of psychological safety, there also has to be some focus on the informal aspects of work, like fun and workplace friendships. Without these things, you're not going to be able to instill psychological safety. Psychological safety comes about from these relationships and pushes employees to be willing to challenge each other and bring about more risk-taking and more innovation. Now let's talk about context. Psychological safety is not always defined in the same ways. For example, a research done on blue-collar jobs actually found that psychological safety is defined by operational safety and procedural success. Now, in these organizations, it found that high psychological safety actually did bring about better performance, so more safety within the workplace and more procedural success. In a 4-year study of education and K through 12 teachers, the performance was actually evaluated by emotional resilience. And what this study interestingly found was that psychological safety actually is a good barrier for burnout. Because teachers were able to have higher psychological safety in the workplace, it helped them not feel as burnt out by the end of the workday. And it led to people being able to have higher emotional resilience because they didn't have to rely so much on just themselves, but rather they could rely on the organization to provide a good psychologically safe environment. Now, despite the strong evidence for how psychological safety impacts the workplace, there are some gaps and limitations with the research. The first one is that there's not a unified definition of what performance exactly is in the workplace. This leads to some issues because we're not able to see exactly how psychological safety impacts different types of performance within different types of organizations and marketplaces. Now, the second gap and limitation within the research is that we don't have a lot of evidence or research regarding the barriers that prevent psychological safety. Now, while I was able to tell you all about ways that we can bring about psychological safety, we're not really sure about how to get rid of certain barriers to psychological safety. For example, like a deeply embedded bureaucracy within an organization that prevents risk-taking. Now, the final gap in the research is that there's a lack of long-term studies regarding this topic. Now, I was able to tell you one study that took place over 4 years. However, that's it. There's not really any other literature that goes over a long period of time. Rather, they're just snapshot studies, meaning that they take place over a brief period of time and just show psychological safety affected in this brief period. There's not any studies that show how it can change and shift over time, and this is something that should be explored. Now, based on this review, there's different implications for managers within organizations. The first one is that managers need to recognize that psychological safety is in a fragile state, and that it can change depending on what they do. And one way that they can bring about higher psychological safety is by creating more ways for workers to be able to create relationships and have fun in the workplace in order to lower interpersonal defenses and to improve the number of relationships within the workplace that can bring about psychological safety and innovation. Managers also need to be able to train their supervisors and bring about more ethical leadership within their organizations. In order to create more ethical leaders, they need to be able to train them and show them how to handle tough conversations and provide ways for their employees to give feedback. This will improve psychological safety in the workplace and bring about more innovation as well. So, in summary, psychological safety is necessary and required in order for high-performance organizations to be able to succeed. Now, there are some next steps that this research can take. Psychological safety is going to change as the workplace continues to change. Different research can be conducted regarding remote workplaces in order to see how psychological safety shifts whenever there's a lack of face-to-face conversation. There also needs to be more research that considers psychological safety over a long period of time rather than just a snapshot of one point of time. So, some final thoughts. Innovation within the workplace is often thought about as something that comes from having great talent in the workplace. However, as we showed today, the literature actually demonstrates that there are some necessary improvements that the workplace needs to make in order to have innovation that's outside of that talent. Instead, psychological safety needs to be focused on within the workplace. It's something complex and it's something that's changing. And managers need to be able to create different ways to bring about this psychological safety in the workplace so that way they can bring about more innovation within their organization. The following references are all of the research that was done in order to be able to create this presentation. All the research demonstrates exactly how innovation is created through psychological safety and why it's a necessary driver for innovation in the workplace.